Hi everyone, welcome to the April 26th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski, and this week we are looking back on last weekend's racing from around the country. We're going to start off at Oaklawn Park, where they ran a couple of graded stakes on Saturday, including the Grade 1 Apple Blossom, the clash of some of the top fillies and mares in the country, including last year's champion Latruska, who was able to win that race for the second year in a row. We'll talk about that, as well as Last Samurai's upset victory in the Grade 2 Oaklawn Handicap. Also some graded stakes action at Keeneland this past weekend. We handicapped some of them on the forecast last week. I wouldn't say that we had the best opinions in those races, but we did see some nice performances from Channel Maker in the Elkhorn and Scalding in the Ben Ally, so we'll talk about those a little bit. Also, they ran the Double Dog Dare earlier in the week at Keeneland, featuring the return of Malathot. We'll dissect that interesting performance and then talk about some maiden breakers and allowance runners that achieved some noteworthy speed figures at that Lexington, Kentucky venue. We'll finish things up later in the podcast at Aqueduct and talk about one race from Laurel. A couple races from each of those venues achieved some pretty nice 120 plus TimeformUS speed figures. But Craig, the race of the weekend really was the Apple Blossom. They ran it pretty early in the day, so we got it out of the way. Would have been nice to have it be the feature towards the end of that Saturday, later in the evening, but don't think that takes away from the performance that Latruska put forth on the racetrack.
No, it was a good effort from her. She got a 119 TimeformUS speed figure. She pretty much had things her own way on the front end. The pace was, I would say, rather moderate, but that wasn't really a surprise if you looked at the pace projector. There was simply nobody else to challenge her in the race. So I'm not going to get too high off of this. I'm just going to assume she maintains her form from last year because she was always running these right around 120 type of speed figures, so she's back in good form. We'll see if there's others out there that can challenge her. We saw in the distaff when things got super hot up front, she wilted, but that was a crazy fast pace that we're really not going to see very often, particularly on regular days. So yeah, I'm not sure what to make of her other than she's a really cool horse that does like to win, because she did get challenged there by Cece, was able to repel her, and never really looked like a loser.
Yeah, I've got to be honest, I was a little surprised that she and Clairiere were as close in odds as they ended up, 4-5 versus 6-5 on the runner-up Clairiere. People after the race seemed somewhat surprised that Clairiere was a little pace compromised in this race. I don't know how you could think that she wasn't going to be. Latruska just seemed like the clear speed on paper, and anybody who was going to tussle with her was going to have a big problem, so nobody did. And she just got the kind of trip that we know that she can handle, and she's always going to be tough to beat when they leave her alone on the front end like that. I mean, it's not like she was walking on the lead. It was a very even pace situation if you look at the TimeformUS pace figures kind of running in that pocket between 118 and 120 for the entire running line. She ended up with a 120 final time figure, just knocked down a little bit to the 119 TimeformUS speed figure, but seems like she's back at her best. That's the kind of speed figure that she was running for much of her championship season last year, and I mean, unless she faces another horse that's really going to make her work on the front end like she faced in the Breeders' Cup last year, it's hard to beat Latruska.
It is. She's very game, and I don't want to take anything away from Clairiere. I thought she ran very well. She got a 118 speed figure, and as you say, she was definitely a bit compromised. It wasn't like it was a crawl up front, but when you give a champion filly everything her own way, I mean, she was clear all the way. She's always going to be tough to beat. So I thought she ran good in defeat, and I thought Cece ran fine too. She ran her normal good race. She had to do a little bit of the dirty work since nobody else was going to really challenge Latruska on the front end, and I thought she ran fine. But Latruska is just a little bit better than those two. But Clairiere is the one. She's a bit of an enigma for me. She just doesn't seem to win a lot. And I assume most of that is because she is pace challenged and always finds herself in these spots where she's far behind and really needs a perfect setup to get things done. So even though I do think she ran well, I think you have to be careful with horses like her because they're a little bit of fool's gold there, I think.
Yeah, I know people were very taken with the visual impression left by Clairiere in her return race at Fairgrounds. Really wasn't beating the best field that day, though, and I feel like maybe she got a little bit inflated in some people's estimation off that performance. Again, not that she ran badly here. She ran really well, just it was always going to be a struggle for her to overcome the pace advantage that Latruska enjoyed. And just to kind of finish up Latruska, Craig, it's pretty cool to see the development that she's made over the years. She used to be this horse that liked to run off on the lead, was very headstrong. And now that she's come back as, I believe, a 6-year-old, she's the kind of horse that almost waits on her competition these days. You see when she makes the lead, she's got her ears pricked, looking around. When they got to the top of the stretch of the Apple Blossom, you could see that she had a little bit more in the tank, but she was drifting a little bit, switching leads, just kind of waiting on the competition to come at her. We saw her show a similar tendency against much weaker competition in her prior race at Gulfstream, but it's nice to know when you're looking ahead to the rest of a campaign with a horse like this that she's not going to overexert herself to beat the competition that she's facing.
Yeah, and it's pretty interesting to see looking at her past performances with and without blinkers. Ever since she took them off, she's just been a different kind of filly. She doesn't run off very often. She ran really fast in the Personal Ensign, but that was kind of a speed bias track. I think that may have been by design, but for the most part, she just rates really nicely on the front end ever since the blinkers were removed, because before that, in her races, you could almost always count on bright red fractions at every call with her up on the front end.
Yeah, I'll be looking forward to her title defense coming up next in the Grade 1 Ogden Phipps on Belmont Stakes Day. We'll see who shows up to face her there. The other graded stakes that was run on Saturday at Oaklawn Park was the Grade 2 Oaklawn Handicap for the older males, and this one featured a bit of an upset as the 12-1 Last Samurai was prominent throughout in this race, and when they turned into the stretch, he just found another gear that the favorites were lacking, and he ran away to beat this field pretty resoundingly.
Yeah, this was quite the surprise for me, I'll be honest. And not because he's not a good horse. He had run good speed figures. He'd been in the upper 1-teens, approaching 120, which was pretty much right there with the favorites, maybe just a point or two below Plainsman and right there with Fearless. But what was surprising for me was how close he was able to stay. He's a horse who even going 1.5 miles last time against Lone Rock in the Temperance Hill Stakes had been pretty far back off the pace. And in this case, he just got a great ride from John Court, who kept the horse close. The pace wasn't overly quick, as we saw in here. And it's not like he won by a half length and got up by a nostril or, at the end or something. He drew away from this field and won easily by 4. Now, I don't think this is the strongest Grade 2 we're ever going to see. You got a 121 speed figure for the effort. So, solid effort, but I would say below par for the class. And when you look through the PPs, that's not really a surprise. I think these are more like Grade 3 horses. But it was an interesting race for sure. I think it was a tactical race. I wonder a little bit about Joel Rosario, if he had just let Plainsman run and set a little bit faster pace. It almost looked like he was more intent on keeping an eye on Fearless than riding his own horse, in my opinion. But Joel Rosario, he's an Eclipse Award winner. He knows what he's doing, I guess. But I wasn't a fan of how he rode Plainsman in this spot.
No, I get it. Plainsman on paper, or I should say on screen, looking at the TimeformUS Pace Projector, he did seem like he was supposed to be the clear speed in this race, and it was not ridden that way, and it just had kind of 3 horses across the track for the majority of the run. And Last Samurai, it's not like John Court was getting after him to challenge so much. He was just basically holding his position towards the inside, but he had that clear path the entire way. Even though he wasn't necessarily on the lead, he never had to deal with any kickback, saving the most ground, racing on the rail. And when they turned into the stretch, there was just that wide opening for him to come right back on through and secure that position. And he had a finish that the others just lacked in this race. He was really running through the wire, and you can kind of see it in the TimeformUS pace figure line. They had been running some steady pace figures, 115 to the midpoint, but he's the only horse that really increased the pace up to the end to get that 124 final time figure, knocked down a little bit because of the slow pace of this race. But I thought this was a nice performance from Last Samurai. And I guess the thing you could say about the top runners in this field is that they had kind of been known quantities. I mean, we know that Plainsman and Fearless are decent grade 2, grade 3 horses. I don't think anybody was expecting a big step forward from either one of them here, but Last Samurai was the up-and-coming newly turned 4-year-old who did have that upside, and he finally took that step forward that he had hinted at he might be able to in the past. I mean, when he had won that poinsettia, he looked like a horse that was on the upswing. It didn't necessarily make that linear step forward in his next couple of starts, but he certainly had the stamina turning back from that 1.5-mile try last time against Lone Rock, and he drew off like the 1.125 was maybe like it was just getting started in this Oaklawn handicap. So definitely an exciting horse for the rest of the year. Let's move on to our next venue, Keeneland, where they ran a few graded stakes last weekend, including a couple on that Saturday card. Grade 2 Elkhorn was probably the feature race, going 1.5 miles on the turf course. And Craig, we tried, I think the three of us, including Mike, we all tried to get a little bit clever in this race, going with Bema's Boy. I didn't think that any one of us would have imagined that Bema's Boy would go off at a much shorter price than Channel Maker. I think Bema's Boy was 5-2 compared to Channel Maker's 7-2. And sometimes the smart money, it just feels like the bettors go a little bit overboard with it. And Channel Maker somehow went off at a massive overlay in this race.
Yeah, that was one. It didn't help me in the pick 5, but as a vertical player, you have to adapt. There's no way I was betting Bema's Boy at 5-2, and he ran fine. But I was really impressed by Channel Maker. I think it was you who made the point that in the last 2 Breeders' Cup turfs, he was the best American finisher. He came in with the best speed figures in the race, and what impressed me the most was how he was able to rate, because almost all of his better performances have come when he's up on the lead, and he was just given a perfect ride by Luis Saez, who they had confidence he didn't have to be on the front end. He just kind of sat back in the pocket in that third position off the speed horses, particularly 2 Emmys, and was able to get the job done and really was never threatened through the lane. So I thought it was a really nice effort by him. I never seem to be on the right side of Channel Maker when he wins, but he is one cool 8-year-old gelding. He just keeps running his races, and I've mentioned this before. It's part of why I've really grown to like the turf division, because these horses stick around and they can deliver top performances even at advanced ages, something we rarely ever see on the dirt.
Yeah, I know there was a lot of talk originally about how much pace was in this race, and I had tried to harp on the forecast last week about how pivotal Phantom Currency was to that projected pace situation, and the race really changed when Phantom Currency scratched, because he was the speed horse that I think we all kind of agreed was the one you wanted to be against, and when he was out of the race, it really changed it. I mean, if you didn't think that 2 Emmys was necessarily going to be best going 1.5 miles, which I know you kind of agreed with me on that, Craig, there was the potential that Channel Maker was just going to inherit the lead at the right point, and when you look through this race and kind of take 2 Emmys out of the equation, Channel Maker was facing a bunch of horses that really in the last couple of years haven't proven themselves to be grade 2, grade 3 caliber horses, at least not winning at that level. So it was not the toughest race for Channel Maker, and he got the job done. I wouldn't even say that he had to show up with his best effort to do it. He just was a little classier than this field. So it's cool to see this horse back and winning again as an 8-year-old. I mean, he feels like he's been a presence in this division forever at this point. So we'll see if anybody steps up later in the year, but it's nice to see Channel Maker still performing at a high level at that advanced age. Other graded stakes on that Saturday card at Keeneland was the grade 3 Ben Ally on the dirt. This one going 1.125 miles for the older horses. And, you know, it's typical Shug McGahee, Craig, with a horse like Scalding. I mean, he didn't look like a superstar when he began his career, but just race after race, he keeps taking one gradual step forward after the next. And we thought that maybe he had reached his apex in the Challenger last time, but he improved even on that victory, winning this Ben Ally pretty convincingly against a better field.
Yeah, he just keeps getting better and better. He's improved nearly every time out on the speed figures, this time all the way up to a 123. So he's a horse that obviously has a lot of talent, and I don't want to say that 123 is his ceiling either, because he won this one pretty easily. I would imagine the 1.125 miles was no problem for him. I think this was his first time trying it, and nothing I saw said he couldn't go another furlong. He just looks like a really good horse who's getting good for Shug, and It's just what you see from his horses. I admit I've underestimated him, but you got to remember he just keeps improving these horses and getting them better. So I think Scalding is a pretty exciting player in the older horse division off this effort, even though it was just a grade 3. Everything I saw visually and numerically looks like he's a real runner.
Yeah, I would say that in the first few months of this year, we've seen quite a few 4-year-olds come out of the woodwork. Horses that weren't necessarily contenders or even participants in last year's Triple Crown, who have really moved forward and are going to make this handicap division, or I should say older horse division, pretty interesting heading into the summer and the second half of the year. I mean, I'm thinking of a horse like Scalding. We're going to talk about a horse at Aqueduct a little bit later in the show. They got a big speed figure. Last Samurai fits into that category as well. It seems like there are some pretty nice 4-year-olds out there that are running these 120 plus TimeformUS speed figures that are going to be a major players in some grade 1 races later in the year. And Scalding feels like that kind of horse. Actually, the top 4 finishers in this Ben Ally were all 4-year-olds. I thought Dynamic One ran pretty well considering the pace dynamics of this race. It's not like they were flying on the front end, and he was really the only horse that made a significant run from the back of the pack. It's just a horse like Dynamic One with no early speed. He's always going to be dependent on the pace coming back to him, and Scalding just never came back to this field. But I thought the top 2 did run really well. The disappointment of this race, Craig, was Warrant, and I know we both had some questions about that speed figure he got in the Santa Anita handicap last time. Feels like maybe that just might not be the most predictive race moving forward for Warrant.
Yeah, that was a tough one. It's just one of those. It fit with the day, but your eyes just didn't really believe it. I thought maybe he would still be good enough to beat this field, but he clearly wasn't. I don't think he really had any excuse. I'm with you. I thought Dynamic One ran pretty well in here. He made another advance in his speed figure. He got a career best 121 for running second, and even Proxy ran a nice race, got a 120 in third. So strong race for a grade 3. If I had to put this one alongside the Oaklawn Stakes or Oaklawn Handicap, I can't remember if it's one of the few handicaps still remaining, but I would say this was the stronger race despite what the grades would say.
The one other graded stakes that they ran this past weekend at Keeneland was the Grade 3 Double Dog Dare, going 1 mile and a 16th for the fillies and mares on Friday's card. And this one featured the return of last year's 3-year-old filly champion, Malathot, as she was making her 4-year-old debut. Now, Craig, I'll let you talk a little bit about the speed figure for this race, because I would imagine this was a tough one. It did not come up as the fastest race in the world. Watching it, not the most visually impressive performance, though I would say Malathot, for as good as she is, she never looks like she's running that fast. And I guess in this case, she wasn't actually running that fast, as it just felt like a race where everybody was looked a little bit discombobulated coming down the stretch.
Yeah, I honestly, I'll admit I don't remember the specifics of making the speed figure. I don't think it was one that was too hard to make or anything. But I remember...
Well, you got I'll just jump in. You got the B notification, this being a breakout race.
Okay. Yeah, I'll have to look that up, and I'll talk about it a little on Twitter. But yeah, I thought it was going to be a bigger race. I think the B actually means it would have been slower had I not done that in this particular case, now that you mention that. And I almost wonder, I remember you talking about it last year after the Ashland, where I just don't think that Keeneland setup where they use the first wire is really a setup that's going to enable Malathot to run her best race, to be honest. So I'm not going to hold the 115 speed figure she got here against her. I expect she's going to make a big move forward next time. And she ran just well enough to get the job done, personally. I mean, Bonnie South, she's okay, but she's a horse without a lot of speed. So, for me, Malathot did what she had to do. And like I said, I expect a big move forward.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really, I guess I wouldn't really agree with the breakout for this race. To me, it looked like a slow race. It looked like the top 2 did not run their races here. So I would have expected a big regression from them. Malathot just looked like, it looked like Todd Pletcher was running her in this race for a reason. I mean, they could have run in the Apple Blossom. They could have waited for the Grade 1 La Troyenne on Derby weekend, which looks like it's not coming up that strong of a race. But Pletcher decided on this Grade 3 event instead. It just feels like they knew she needed a race, and she did not come forth with her A effort here. So, I mean, you could compare this to a mile and a 16th race that was run just 2 races earlier, race 7 on the card. That was a maiden event won by a horse that actually I think is pretty promising, the $4 million yearling purchase, Aussie Pride. But Malathaat, I think, ran just 2/5 faster than that horse. So I feel like the lower figure makes a lot more sense for this race. But she obviously can improve. Malathaat's a horse that is never going to go off and win a race by 5 lengths, kind of like what we were talking about with Latruska. I mean, she's a horse that definitely runs to her competition, so she tends to make it a little bit close. She waits on horses. She's not great with her lead changes. We saw that in upper stretch of this race. She just looked like she had some kinks to work out in this return from the layoff. So we'll see what they decide to do with her next. I would imagine that based on her accomplishments from last year, a race like the Ogden Phipps would have to be on the radar. I know Todd Pletcher mentioned that as a potential goal after this race, this being the prep. But even though the TimeformUS speed figures say she ran just 4 points slower than Latruska, in my estimation, she's got a long way to come off this performance to be competitive with those that we saw in the Apple Blossom.
And for the record, the breakout wasn't a huge one. It was only 7 points. And part of that was the 7th race. If I rated the 4th, 7th, and 9th, and I think the 7th was a good race. I forget the name of the maiden who won, but it came back pretty quick, a 104 or so, I think it was. But it would have made it quite a bit higher. So it's definitely one I'm going to be keeping an eye on. It was just, it almost seemed too slow to believe, even for the back runners in the field. So that's why the breakout was. It came between 2 turf races. So, who knows if the track was worked on in between. But definitely one worth monitoring going forward.
Move on to a few more races from Keeneland, some non-stakes events. On Saturday, to kick off that late pick 5 sequence, we saw a visually impressive performance in the 6th race on Saturday at Keeneland. The 3-year-old filly Casa de Goat winning by about a dozen lengths for Brad Cox. But Craig, we had kind of talked about this race on the forecast last week. Among those with experience coming into this race, there really wasn't a whole lot in this field, and I'm not sure that Casa de Goat was beating that much.
No, she wasn't, but she ran pretty fast. She got a 113 speed figure for the effort. And it seems like they must have known she was a good one. She wound up getting bet down to 4-5. Part of that, I would say, was because of the field she was facing. But, I mean, it wasn't like they were totally hopeless. Some of the horses had run 90 types, and mid-90s type TimeformUS speed figures. So I do think she's a runner. To do that from the inside, we talked about how that could be a little tough sometimes for first-time starters. She handled it with no problem. She ran fast early and just kept running away from them. She did run like a sprinter to me. She's not one that looks like she wants to stretch out, but, who knows, given her some more time and some training. I'll leave that to other people to decide. But for me, I thought it was a really nice run.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't want to be too down on her because she did earn a 113 TimeformUS speed figure, which is the kind of number that some of the top contenders in the Kentucky Oaks in her same age group are going to be, her running coming into that race. Just from a visual standpoint, to me, it really felt like nobody else showed up in this race. So she did run away impressively. For me, the jury's still out on what kind of horse she is. We'll see. This number says that she's graded stakes quality. I want to see her prove it in her next race. And yeah, I think that the jury's still out on what kind of distance she's ultimately going to prefer. She did set a fast pace here, and she got quite a nice pace upgrade for that TimeformUS speed figure from 105 final time number. So we'll see what she's able to do in her next race for Brad Cox. We did see a similarly impressive maiden victory on Sunday's card at Keeneland, going that is same about 7 furlong distance by the 5th-time starter B. Doc, a California shipper for Doug O'Neill, who came in, did not take that much money in this race. I think went off at 8-1, but ran like he could have been 1-9 because, I mean, he was just far superior to this field and earned a nice 111 TimeformUS speed figure.
Yeah, it was a really nice effort from him. He was a horse who in California had tried turf, had tried synthetic, but his best efforts had come on dirt. Both times he had run mid-90s type speed figures, and last time out he ran into a horse who kind of looks like one of those Bob Bradford freaks in High Connection who won by 10 lengths. So it was only a couple more lengths back to B. Dog. So Yeah, maybe the change of scenery helped, but whatever. This was a pretty strong effort, and this is a race coated with all blue fractions. But part of that is just because of how fast B Doc was able to finish off the 7.5 furlongs. It's not like the rest of the field was tiring. He was just running away from them, including the 8-5 favorite exact estimate. So I thought this was a nice effort from him.
Yeah, over this exact same distance, B Doc gets a TimeformUS speed figure that is 2 points lower than Casa de Goat, but it should be noted that this horse got a final time number that's 12 points faster than the other one. The speed figures kind of went in opposite directions because Casa de Goat set a faster pace and B Doc set a slower pace, but no doubt that B Doc ran the much faster race than the filly, and the number totally checks out for those that finished in behind B Doc, the also-rans. I mean, that numbers in line with them. This horse just apparently took a huge step forward. It was his first race without blinkers. All 4 of his prior starts came with blinkers, and they took them off for this race. So potentially that made a difference. This horse was a very expensive 2-year-old in training purchase. I think West Point paid $425,000 for him. So expectations were there, and it feels like he finally fulfilled them. I should also note this horse was coming out of a maiden race in California on March 26th, won by the Bob Baffert trained first-time starter High Connection. We've seen 2 runbacks from that race, B Doc and also a horse who finished 5th, who have significantly improved their speed figures in their subsequent races. So that horse High Connection, who I would imagine is with a different trainer now, maybe Tim Yachtine, I haven't seen reporting about that, but he's one that maybe is coming out of a very strong race at Santa Anita that you might want to check out when he makes his second start. Craig, let's finish up Keeneland with one more race from earlier in the week, a Wednesday allowance event on the turf, won by Camp Hope. This is a horse that I know we had been impressed by last year when he won a couple races at Keeneland last fall. The trip didn't really work out for him when they tried the Grade 1 Hollywood Derby last year, but coming back off the layoff as a 4-year-old, this horse got back on track.
Yeah, he did. He's just another one of those improving 4-year-olds. Not really sure what happened at Del Mar. I guess he had he did have a kind of rough trip that day. Wasn't able to get his preferred position up near the front end, but he came back nicely and looks like one that's going to be a force in the Turf division because he got a 120 TimeformUS speed figure. He did it. It's not like he had to be on the front end. He has that good tactical speed where he can just sit a couple lengths off the lead, and he was able to. I mean, it was a tight finish with Beacon Hill, who's a pretty decent horse, but both of them were coming off of layoffs. I thought it was just a good effort from him and one that he can build on.
Yeah, it was a very exciting race to watch. You had 3 horses that were all separated by about a nose at the wire. It looked like Camp Hope maybe had gotten the bob, but it was very, very tight. And he did hold on. I thought Brian Hernandez gave him a good ride, saved ground in the pocket for much of the way, angled out, and was able to take the lead in the stretch. But it looked like some horses towards the outside, including Beacon Hill, had really built up more momentum than him, having gotten into the clear a bit sooner. But Camp Hope was able to gut it out. I think the one thing that Camp Hope has to prove, Craig, is that he can run one of these big speed figures outside of Keeneland, because all of his impressive victories on the turf and his best TimeformUS speed figures have all come at this venue. He's going to have to try a different racetrack next time out if he stays healthy and runs in the next month or so. I think he can do it because I do believe he had a big excuse last time in the Hollywood Derby, but you do want to see these horses able to branch out at other circuits.
Yeah, I would be on the side that he probably can. I thought his race at Saratoga, I think that was his first race on the turf, was fine, and he's developed ever since then. Even Kentucky Downs, it's not like he run poorly at 1 mile and 5/16, and was just kind of a development pattern. And I think more it's a timing thing. He just happened to get good at Keeneland, at his best at Keeneland, had a bit of a tough trip. But yeah, it is a little bit of a question mark, I guess. But, I just would say this, even though it's just an allowance race, I forget, I think it was like a non-winners of 3 other than, this was basically a stakes race because, the purse $130,000, if you look through the field, there's some really good horses with a lot of recognizable names in here. So this was a strong race for sure.
Move up north to New York to discuss what I believe, Craig, is the biggest TimeformUS speed figure out of this past weekend. That was earned on Friday at Aqueduct by Pipeline in a 1-turn mile allowance event. This horse definitely had some things in his favor with regard to the way the racetrack was playing, but Pipeline is a horse for Chad Brown that had showed promise as a 3-year-old last year. They probably tried too tough a spot last time out in the Cigar Mile to conclude his 2021 campaign, but coming back off the layoff here, he established himself as a horse that could be a force to be reckoned with going this 1 mile distance moving forward.
Yeah, I'll be honest, I didn't follow the track that much on Friday at Aqueduct, but I do see it's coated in bright red as speed favoring. I'll let you say if the rail was also good as well. Usually those things are a combination or some sort of they work with each other, but no doubt about it, he ran fast. He started out quick and just kept going that way as a very even pace line with all the figures in the mid 120s, all the way to that 125 overall TimeformUS speed figure. So yet another promising 4-year-old that we didn't see a lot of last year. He did run in the Cigar Mile, and I put air quotes around run because he wasn't much of a factor after the start, but I would suspect maybe something went a little wrong that day because we didn't see him until this race, so maybe he had a little bit of a problem that day, but whatever it is, he can run for sure, and another prospect in the stakes division.
Yeah, the track at Aqueduct this past week, but especially on that Friday card, was playing towards speed and also horses that had rail position on the racetrack, and Pipeline did enjoy both of those advantages, but it wasn't one of those tracks where horses that were riding the rail were routinely drawing off to win by 10 lengths. I would say that maybe it added a length or two, maybe a little bit more than that to some horses' performances. So it's not like this win was a completely phony one by Pipeline. He's a good horse. He was just maybe carried along a little bit to earn that career best 125 TimeformUS speed figure, but he had shown last year that he's a good horse. Like you said, the Cigar Mile, too tough a spot for him, but we've seen a few horses come out of that Cigar Mile from last year to run back, and I think all of them have won out of that race. Another one who has done some nice things as a 4-year-old coming out of a 3-year-old performance in the Cigar Mile is Olympiad, and no reason why Pipeline can't do some similar things as they inevitably move him up to stakes company for his next start. He seems like an exciting prospect for Chad Brown.
Yeah, and Plainsman was another one out of that race, and it just makes you to long a little bit to get the returns of American Revolution and Following Sea, who ran 1-2 for Todd Pletcher in that race, because they ran big speed figures that day, and they would even had just more depth to the older horse division.
Well, speaking of Chad Brown trainees, the other 2 stakes races that we're going to talk about from last weekend at Aqueduct were both won by horses from that barn. The Woodhaven for the 3-year-old colts on Saturday, won by the still undefeated Unanimous Consent. This horse is now 3 for 3 in his career, and all of his wins have looked pretty much the same. He has to be asked to go around the far turn, but once this horse straightens away in the lane, he just draws off from his competition with powerful strides. I like what I've seen from this horse.
Yeah, he's good. He's one I don't think the speed figures, even though we upgrade the closing fraction a little bit, are capturing exactly how good he is, because the paces he's been in haven't been, well, this one wasn't much of a crawl, but just the way he was able to win so easily, I don't think it's reflected in the number. He only got a 102 here. He previously ran a 98 and 100, but I suspect he's a little bit better that if asked, and if he ever gets into a race with a lot of pace in it. He did have pace in his very first race at Monmouth, but that was as a pretty early season 2-year-old where you don't expect horses to run well, but that 99 would translate well into the hundreds here. So I think with a better setup, we're going to see him run a good number.
Yeah, and he also, to me, feels like a horse that is going to relish some added ground in the future. A mile and a 16th in this race, I think, is the farthest that he's gone yet, but he feels like the kind of horse that Chad Brown would have the race like the Grade 1 Belmont Derby going a mile and a quarter penciled in. This horse is from, I think, the first crop of the European sire Almanzor, a horse that was a real mile and a quarter specialist in Europe. And this horse might be the best runner from that first crop, because I don't think Almanzor has had a big 2-year-old in Europe, or I guess I should say 3-year-old now that they're a year older. But feels like Unanimous Consent is a runner with some real potential for Chad Brown. I don't think we've seen the best out of this horse yet. It was interesting watching him coming around the far turn. turn, because kind of like his race at Tampa last time out, it felt like he was idling a little bit coming around the turn. Franco really had to ask him to go. Seemed like initially at the quarter pole, he was not keen to come around a horse that was right in front of him in his path. But once he steered him into the clear, I mean, he was closing in tandem with 022305 on the outside, and in just a couple strides, he put that horse away and settled this issue pretty easily in the end. So I think this is one that, despite that mediocre 102 TimeformUS speed figure, is a horse that we might see some faster numbers from when he stretches out further in the future.
Yeah, and just to build on that a little, I just think this were one of the cases where the number fits perfectly for the rest of the field, but he was just so much better, and it was one of those timed moves where he just was ridden to win the race, not to run fast. So I think the number's good for the race. I just think he's a lot better than what it came up.
And in the filly division of this race, the Memories of Silver on Sunday, going that same 1.16 distance on the turf. For the 3-year-olds, we saw, again, a couple of runners, Craig, that looked like they were just in a different class than the rest, as Pizza Bianca and Consumer Spending both coming out of that Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies turf. Of course, Pizza Bianca having won that race. They faced off here, and Consumer Spending, despite the fact that there was no pace on whatsoever, she just sprinted through the lane right past Pizza Bianca, and feels like of the two, she was the one that was really ready to go off the layoff.
Yeah, and to be honest, I think Consumer Spending's the best horse. I mean, Pizza Bianca got the job done in the Breeders' Cup, but it was not a very good race. I think Consumer Spending had some trouble in there, didn't really run a race, but I think this was much more representative of the abilities of the two horses. The winner, Consumer Spending, got a 111. Pizza Bianca only a 103. Now, I'm not saying that's her max. Maybe she will come back a little better. There wasn't a lot of pace in here. Maybe she's a horse that prefers a fast pace to set up her kick, where Consumer Spending was right on her flank, but without a lot of pace in here. So, maybe they're a little closer than the figures would indicate, that 111 and 103. But in a rematch, I would take the winner every time.
Yeah, I get why there's such a disparity in TimeformUS speed figures. Consumer Spending getting that 111 and Pizza Bianca getting a 103, an 8-point difference, despite the fact that they were just separated by 3/4 of a length. And that's due to the fact that Consumer Spending quickened so much in the stretch off that slow pace. And, I was looking up some of the track stats for this race. I was curious how fast Consumer Spending actually came home. And they've got her running a final quarter mile in 22.28 seconds, which is pretty fast for Aqueduct. You don't see Aqueduct producing those kind of come home times like you sometimes see at Belmont, where they can come home very fast. So that's some serious late speed shown by Consumer Spending. I wouldn't say I totally agree with you, Craig, on their relative merits. I thought Pizza Bianca did run the better race in the Breeders' Cup. I didn't see Consumer Spending having a ton of trouble in that race. Pizza Bianca is a horse that showed a big turn of foot when she won that Breeders' Cup, and I think for a horse that runs that way with a big burst of speed, she probably was not suited to the way that she was ridden in this Memories of Silver. If you go back and watch the race from the half-mile pole home, you could see that Jose Ortiz was obviously concerned about the pace and trying to get her into the race a little bit sooner, but he put her 3 wide at the half-mile pole with no cover and made that run all the way around the far turn, basically with no horse in front of her, just kind of moving up on the outside. And for a horse that typically runs as a deep closer, when you run an entire turn 3 wide with no cover, I think that saps that explosive kick that you're used to seeing from them. So it's not surprising to me that Consumer Spending had the better finish, because she kind of worked out that trip where she was able to follow Pizza Bianca into the stretch and then kick out and make that explosive run. So I think that slight difference in the trips was telling here. So I'm not going to be surprised if they both get into a race with more pace, that we see a result like we saw in the Breeders' Cup last year. It's going to be interesting to see. And also, it is worth noting, Chad Brown has much better numbers coming off layoffs than Christophe Clement does. So that's just, an interesting discussion. But I think the speed figures point out these are two talented 3-year-old fillies.
Yeah, and you make a good point about the pace. Being wide around that turn, particularly when in a race like this, the race is getting faster, isn't where you want to be. And that's kind of what I was alluding to, is I think she might be a horse who's going to do her best running in races that have those red fractions, not the blue type. Whereas I think Consumer Spending may be a little more versatile in that area.
Well, Craig, let's close things out on this podcast with one more turf race, but at a different venue. Let's move down a little bit to Laurel in Maryland, where the final race they ran on their Saturday card was the Henry Clark Stakes. And I think we had mentioned this horse when he made his U.S. debut at Tampa on the Pacecast. I believe we talked about that allowance event because it had got a nice speed figure. But Chez Pierre, this 4-year-old gelding, now takes his career record to 5 for 5 with this win in the Henry Clark. And turf horses don't get much more visually impressive than this one.
Yeah, this guy can run, and we definitely did talk about it. We said it was pretty visually impressive. He had got a 119, upgraded from a 115 because of how he finished it off. And what surprised me in here was there was a really good horse in here named Field Pass. He was coming out of a tough start in the Pegasus, but he had some pretty decent credentials coming into this race, including winning the Seabiscuit 2 races back. But better seem to know because Chez Pierre went off 4 to 5 in here, and man, he was good. I'm not sure what the future holds for this horse, but he absolutely demolished this field. And it wasn't one of those where, he just had a super easy trip. He was just able to kind of float up on the outside and roll by with, it was something to see. He got a 120 Timeform US speed figure for the win, and it would not surprise me if he could improve that one quite a bit, which is, might sound a little like hyperbole, but I actually believe it watching the race. If you haven't seen it, I would recommend people go out and watch the replay because Laurel does put all their races on YouTube for free, so it's easy to go see, and it was something. I'm really curious to see where this guy shows up next because I want to see how he stacks up.
Yeah, I'm with you on this one. Listeners, if you have not been following some of the recent stakes action at Laurel, it's worth checking out. We talked about Penny Baker last week being so impressive off the trainer switch to Mike Stidham, and I feel like we have a similar situation here with a new import. This was obviously a second start in the country, but Chez Pierre for Arnaud Delacour, it just feels like a horse that is bound to make an impact in graded stakes later this season. And like Craig was saying, there were some decent horses in this race. Field Pass, coming off the far turn, really drifted wide. He carried this horse out into about the 6 or 7 path, but that did not stop Chez Pierre's momentum. He was unbothered, went right by Field Pass and opened up on this field. Impressive performance from this horse. We'll see what his ceiling is, how far he wants to go. It does feel like he might be a 1-mile specialist, but there are some big races out there going a mile that have that graded stakes tag on them. So definitely one that I think is going to be an exciting horse to follow later in the season.
Yeah, one thing for sure, there's nothing wrong with being a miler on the turf because you will have plenty of opportunities.
Well, Craig, that's it for our recap on this podcast. Got some exciting things coming up. The Kentucky Derby, obviously, in less than 2 weeks. I saw that our colleague running the TimeformUS Twitter account just tweeted out the TimeformUS Pace Projector, or the early one for the advanced PPs for the Kentucky Derby. People can check that out on TimeformUS's Twitter account. But definitely some people are starting to discuss that race. I'm sure next week we'll do a bit more of a deep dive into the Derby on one of the podcasts we do Derby Week. We might just do one podcast that week. But I know, Craig, we also talked about maybe doing a more in-depth video that we'll put out on DRF's YouTube channel around the Derby. You said you might be able to join me for one of those. So we'll put out some Derby content eventually. I know we haven't discussed it too much yet, but we are aware there are some exciting things on the horizon in the racing world.
Yeah, I will definitely join you for the Derby week, do some video work. Looking forward to the Derby. I'm not one that handicaps it weeks in advance, but I still love to dig through the PPs and look. One of the things that makes it tough, we've already had a change, I guess, for me, inexplicably, Classic Causeway is back on the trail. So that's already going to change that pace projector that was put out. So I imagine that'll be updated pretty soon. But we will see. It's always fun times these weeks. Usually the field changes a bit but between now and then. But that and the Oaks both look like really fun races this week. But for now, I will try to figure out what we're going to talk about this week on Friday, and kind of after this weekend, next week is when I'll really get into the Derby talk.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I've been trying to avoid wading into the Derby conversation too much because I feel like I really do want to see how some things shake out over the next week or so, especially the post positions. The race just feels so wide open this year. I don't want to tie myself to any opinion too early. I also want to see how people are assessing different contenders, where the money's going to go, because I think searching for the right value horse is going to be especially important this year when it seems a little bit uncertain how this race is going to be bet. Even now, just about 11 days out from the race. So I think that there are some things that we want to monitor before we finalize our Kentucky Derby opinions. But as Craig said, we'll definitely put out some content about that next week. Yeah, Craig, I don't think we've talked too much about what we're going to handicap on Friday, but we'll figure that out and maybe put something out on Twitter about that a little bit later in the week. Everybody remember, you can always listen to these podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcast. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for tuning in this week, and make sure to catch that TimeformUS forecast coming up later in the week.